Hey, what's up, everyone? Dragon back again, here to tell you that you should be reading Dinosaur Planet Survivors. So, Dinosaur Planet Survivors is a 1984 science fiction novel written by the late Anne McCaffrey and serves as a sequel to Dinosaur Planet, which we talked about on the last you should be reading. And I need to point out real quick, there's going to be some minor spoilers because to kind of talk about the basic premise of this story, I'm going to kind of have to give away the end of the last one. So if you haven't read this book, the first book yet, which again I recommend, probably wait to listen to this one, unless really you don't care about spoilers and whatever. But if you're one of those people who just don't want to be spoiled on anything, go ahead and read the first book first, and then maybe listen to this one. Even though I kind of figured if you read the first book, you're probably just going to want to read the second one anyway. So regardless, spoilers, you've been warned. So the end of the first book, the heavy world is essentially take control of the expedition and force basically the survivors to kind of go into like suspend animation. Basically, they have to kind of go back in their sleeping pods and just kind of try to wait everything out. And basically, they sleep for a number of decades. I believe it's about 40, 43 years, give or take, something like that, where they are kind of awakened in this new world, essentially. And, basically a generation has gone by. And they kind of awaken, and the heavy worlders have set up a colony on this planet, albeit illegally. And now there's since then been an entire generation that has been grown and raised here and living out in this new civilization, more of an agrarian civilization, but they're still here. And basically, if the first book kind of was essentially our negligence and essentially just continue to kind of perpetrate and propagate kind of age-old biases or forms of discrimination, and then having it kind of bite us in the ass. This book is in a weird way learning to kind of not judge people by the mistakes of their ancestors, by their forebears, because while the heavy worlders led this mutiny and or were responsible for the events of the first novel, their descendants, they are now products of this world, products of this new society. And the question becomes, is it right then to kind of judge them for the sins of their fathers, so to speak? And there are a couple, or at least I believe from what I remember, one character specifically of the Heavy Worlders from the first book that is still alive, but they encounter these younger members of the society, the descendants, if you will, like the Heavy Worlders, who are now the people of this planet. And is it right to essentially vilify them or demonize them because of what their forebears did? It's not to excuse what their parents did, essentially, but more or less as it is to kind of just accept the fact that, okay, while if things have gone the way they should have, this generation on this planet would have never have been. What happened, and now here they are. So now we have to kind of move forward with the reality that they exist and they're here, and they didn't ask to be here. They didn't be asked to be the product of kind of this mutiny. But they are, and doesn't mean that they are evil because of it, because they themselves have not done anything. They were just born into this world. I mean, depending on who you guys are, you could have, ancestry where you have people who, did terrible things in their ancestry. People you might have, ancestors that were slave owners, for instance. Does that mean you are as guilty as them? I mean, so long as you don't hold any of their, their grudges and their prejudices and their kind of racism, then no, you should not be held responsible for that. As long as you yourself are a good person and don't, continue on that legacy, you just happen to be, a descendant of that legacy, well, that's not your fault. You're just, people reproduce and have new generations of children, and it's really up to those children to kind of grow up and decide what kinds of people they are going to be. So you should not be held responsible for something your grandfather did, your great-grandfather did, or even your father or mother did. Every generation is a fresh start. And while it can be difficult to sometimes kind of break out of those traditions, being that they're probably just kind of ingrained in you from day one, in theory, you still have that choice to some degree. And if you choose a different path than those who came before you, you should not be then automatically punished for what they did, because they chose to do what they did, and you chose to do what you did. And just because they are your parents or grandparents or whatever, doesn't mean, that's you. They are individuals unto themselves, and therefore they should be judged for their actions, not the actions of those who came before or the actions of those came after, for the actions they themselves, you committed. Just like if you don't do any of that and choose a more righteous path, well, then that's how you should be judged as a righteous person, because those are the choices you made for you. And it kind of is kind of a little bit the interesting, the situation they find themselves in now in this essentially new world, is that there's a whole new generation who was not responsible for the events, in the first story, and therefore is it really, right to judge them? I mean, and the story, like the first one, is more than just kind of this social allegory. Again, I like the first book. The social allegory is actually much more subtle than I'm probably making it out to be. But with all these videos, I don't like to just give you like a review of the book or a synopsis of the book, because I figure you could just go on Wikipedia right now and get a plot summary of the whole book, and that'll tell you whatever you want to know in terms of that. Whereas I try to kind of talk more about my takeaway from it, kind of the more underlying themes that maybe I might have walked away with based on my own personal sensibilities that maybe you might not have noticed based on what you take away from it. So I like to kind of share that with you. So again, this is still a cool futuristic science fiction book about people on an alien planet and dinosaurs. And in this story, you come to find out why there are dinosaurs on this planet. And it's actually kind of an interesting reasoning behind it that is kind of theorized in the first book and just kind of confirmed in the second one. But kind of the reason why it happened and why it wasn't necessarily known by everyone is actually kind of interesting. So that's kind of what the characters are dealing with in the forefront of the story. Like, okay, so what's going on with this planet? How did all this happen? And what do we do now? But there is still that whole concept when they meet these other people from this world now. It's like, how do we deal with them? Like, how do we view them? Are they the enemy because they look like the people who forced us to go into suspended animation? But it's not them. They are different people. They weren't even alive when all this happened. They're a different generation, and they probably weren't even too familiar with what was going on before. Because again, it's the heavy worlders took control. They created a colony, and they kind of got what they wanted, their own society here. So they're really not to blame. The people who are responsible are to blame, and then you should deal with them accordingly. And they are in the course of the story. But the people left behind, this new generation, it's like, do we continue to make the same mistakes? By vilifying them, would we essentially just be continuing kind of this cycle, so to speak? Or by maybe learning from our past mistakes of, putting groups of people in boxes and leaving them there and kind of relegating them, like, that is your role, you can be no more nor less, and learning from that mistake and realize, here we kind of a fresh start with these people, and let's do it right. Let's not, ban them. Let's not bind them. Let's not tell them what they are and what they cannot be. Let's bring them in. Let's incorporate them. Let's treat them as equals, so we can all kind of grow together. And that's kind of what this story, in a lot of ways, is. It's a second chance to get it right. For as much as the heroes in the story were, the victims, they were still part of a system that created a problem that resulted in the events of the first story. So this is kind of a second chance to get it right, to kind of everyone learning from the mistakes of the generations that came before and not repeating them again, and kind of starting fresh and getting it right this time around. And that's was me kind of the big takeaway from the story, in addition to all the cool sci-fi stuff with dinosaurs, because that's always fun, and that's what makes this, again, the story fun. But like a lot of Anne McCaffrey's work, and her stories make you think, they make you contemplate, they make you question. And again, that's one of the reasons I've always loved her writing, especially in the Dragon Riders or Persian series, where on the surface it's a great fantasy sci-fi story, but it has characters that you can relate to, and characters that kind of force you to ask maybe questions that you wouldn't necessarily ask yourself without a prompt, so to speak. So that's really kind of all there is to say about this story. And in a lot of ways, it's a much simpler story than Dinosaur Planet. It's more, again, the result of the events of Dinosaur Planet, and basically how we are going to choose to move forward now. This is the fallout. This is the result of it. So where do we go from here? It's kind of up to us at this point, and that's kind of basically what this story really felt like to me. It's kind of like, where do we go from here? So it's a much simpler story in that respect, and I feel a lot more stripped down in that way. But I feel it's more of an open road at the end of it, whereas the first one it was very much like, okay, this is the consequence. But now that that's happened, okay, now it's time to see where we go from here, so to speak. So it's a cautionary tale. The first one was a cautionary tale. This one is more of, I think it has a lot more hope to it because it then realizes, okay, we may have paid for the sins of the past, but now that we paid for it, we're free to kind of go about as we see fit. We're done paying the price. So now we can move forward. We can kind of, we can pick ourselves back up and just kind of get it right this time around. So that was kind of my big takeaway from Dinosaur Planet's Survivors. So with that said, have you read it? If so, what did you think? If you have not, as always, I'll put links in the description section below where you can pick it up, give it a read, check it out, give me some of your thoughts. It's always kind of nice to go back and read some of these older science fiction stories. Now, kind of, not just because, hey, it's cool sci-fi, but kind of seeing some of how some of the sci-fi writing differed, like in, for instance, the 80s, and kind of seeing more like this retro take on the future, because it seems like so much of now what was once considered science fiction is happening in real life, and we're still now living out in space and having contact with alien races and what have you. But just your approach to technology and kind of how people of a kind of pre-internet, pre-digital era really interpreted the future and what future tech would be like, so to speak, before a lot of this, the genesis of a lot of this technology even started. And so it's kind of cool just to kind of read these stories for, to get a sense of how, essentially the past viewed the future, compared to how maybe we do view the future today, because I think it definitely has changed with, how technology has progressed. But anyway, these are just some of my thoughts. I could go on and on about this sort of thing, and I would. But anyway, I'll spare you guys the rest. But anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace!